Migrant Media, of which the author is a participant, is a collective of migrant, black, and refugee film activists established in 1988 in London. They formed the collective as self-taught filmmakers who had also been engaged in political research and activism in their communities. The unifying factor was a need to tell stories that were ignored by the mainstream media. They had a strong sense of coming from countries with backgrounds of liberation struggle and of sharing some of the experiences of earlier Black and Asian communities. The Marxist analysis on controlling the means of production and distribution when applied to filmmaking was a very stark reality. Without smartphones, digital cameras, social media, and the internet, access to the means of production and distribution was limited. Production, television companies, was controlled by the elites, and distribution, television broadcasters, controlled by the state. It was necessary for the collective to make critical alliances, which they did with Agence Media, based in France. Agence Media is a collective of media workers in video, photography, and journalism from Arab, African, Asian, and other minorities in France. It emerged in 1983 after a media training scheme organized in Lyon, mainly from working-class areas. People who came to the scheme had experience of documenting their local situation, and the main idea was how to access a national audience for their films. All the participants had been involved in campaigns against racist crimes, deportations, police violence, or poor housing. The first collaboration between Migrant Media and Agence Media was the film Britain's Black Legacy, which was part of a series of films called Humanities of Resistance. Britain's Black Legacy showed how, from 1958 Notting Hill riots and the murder of Kelso Cochrane, a black man who was killed by the far right, to the murder of Roland Adams, another black man killed 50 years later, that black communities had fought on the streets and in the courts for the basic human right to live without fear of racial attacks. The film covered the cases of self-defense such as the Mangrove 9, the Bradford 12 and UM7, as well as racist murders and community response to such incidents as the New Cross massacre. The story of the Bradford 12 seemed crucially important within black struggles, and yet it had not received the attention of similar cases such as the Mangrove 9 in London. Bradford 12 was known but ignored, despite being a remarkable feat of community resistance. In 1981, 12 young Asian men were arrested and charged with terrorism for defending Bradford from an imminent racist skinhead attack. Following national and international protests in support of the defendants and a long trial, they were acquitted, arguing that they were defending their communities in the face of far-right violence and police racism. All 12 were released, and the right to community self-defense was established. In the 40 years since, Migrant Media built political and creative alliances with some of the Bradford 12 defendants, collaborating on a number of film projects, but not the Bradford 12 story. This was partly due to the political direction Migrant Media had taken in terms of its grassroots approach in working with the families of black people that had been killed by the police, which, from 1995, became their main focus. The decision to focus on community resistance to the ongoing killings by the police left little space to commit resources to other projects, and Migrant Media's radical work was severely marginalized by a denial of access to media funders. Ironically, it was the death of George Floyd, a black man, that was filmed whilst being murdered by the police in Minnesota, USA in 2020 that shifted attitudes in bourgeois media in the UK. They urgently had to respond to the visceral public concern and the demonstrations that followed the Floyd killing in a global protest, which had also reignited the Black Lives Matter movement. After decades of largely ignoring the growing fascism and racism sweeping Europe and the UK, the public discourse around police violence dominating social media forced terrestrial broadcasters to respond. A limited number of mainstream films around black struggles were produced, but their focus was not at all grassroots or political, and the history of militant forms of organizing against racist violence is yet to be told. The militancy of the Bradford 12 and their decision to make petrol bombs to use against the fascists was influenced by their lived experience. In the 1970s, racist chants and racist attacks were widespread, especially what was offensively called Paki bashing. Tariq Mahmood recalls, in his own words, it was a daily and sometimes more nightly pastime where white youth would hunt us. However, it was not something we took lying down, but fought back against. Individually, we had to, but we also organized community self-defense as well, against both street and institutional racism of the police, the immigration service, and even within the trade union movement. Given the widespread nature of the racist wave of street violence and the murders that were taking place at the time, the Bradford 12 had learned from bitter experience that the police were unwilling to defend black people. From its inception, an important decision taken by migrant media was a process of archiving community narratives by frequently gathering filmed actuality and testimonies. It was a process that sought to document a collective experience rather than produce media outputs. The focus was on the resistance to racism, police abuse, immigration raids, deportation, and the functioning of self-defense groups. The working relationship with Agence Media had a fundamental influence on this approach. Moving the margins to the center and building radical communities was central to their documentary process and ethos. Over 3 decades, migrant media has developed a methodology of practice of what we call a documentary of force, which is defined as 4 elements. 1, process, working with groups of people over long periods of time in an embedded praxis that works against the monoform, as defined by Watkins. Number 2, impact, measured by results from cultural practice when disseminated. The practice of third cinema, as outlined by Solanas and Gattino in 1971, is a text that offers a blueprint for film maximum impact. Number 3, approach, examining specific issues, but from a central ideology of resistance. And the idea with this is not to deal with victimology, not to deal just with the pain, but to deal with the resistance to attack and deal with the resistance to brutality. And finally, number 4, formations. The development of what Gramsci called the organic intellectual in the filmmaker and in the participants. And this Gramscian model defines connectivity within the filmmaking process. Much of this methodology found its seeds in the collaborating with Agence Media and exposure of oppositional filmmaking of third cinema. In France, the trajectory of militant immigrant filmmaking was embedded in the community. In the mid-70s, a movement of young, working-class immigrants appeared. Trouble began on the estates when these young people, many of whom were unemployed, were hanging around on the streets and were confronted by the police. Fights would break out, and then the police would deport them. At the same time, the youth began to demand, "Come what may, we're here to stay." Speaking about the experience of young Arabs in France at the time, interviewing with Mognis Abdallah from Agence Media, he said, "We wanted to give a cultural expression of this movement on a national basis, and we set up Rock Against the Police. We had experience of how to gain access to media, working as a collective. We made some short films, including one in 1980, which followed the debate around the housing estates. After the screening, a lot of people tried to get in touch with us. So the idea of getting into the mainstream, not just as victims or witnesses, but to start challenging the media, telling our version of things, was a growing skill in communication. The increasingly high-profile killing of immigrant youth by the police in the urban housing estates led to the March pour Égalité, the March for Equality and Against Racism, which arrived in Paris in 1983 on December the 3rd. Led by the youth, an estimated number of 100,000 people who had begun on the outskirts of Marseille and in the period of several months had grown into a national movement that had marched on Paris, the capital city of France. "It's our May 1968, said one of them, overcome with emotion." So cites a report written in 2006 by Bourd and Masquelet. Agence Media were on the ground with a militant approach, participating and documenting the events. Again, Mognis Abdallah outlines, it was the beginning of a great movement in the 1980s, so we wanted to provide material so that people could think about what's happening in France. We experienced that a film shown 300 to 400 times in local meetings can have much more impact than a film shown on television between 2 sitcoms and 5 adverts. It's a political choice when and who sees our films. Recorded by Fero in 1988. Concurrently, the motivation that had driven the Bradford 12 to organize existed in France. In 1982, Wahid Hashishi, an 18-year-old student from Boulogne-Valin, was shot and killed by police in Lyon. And Abdenabi Gouami, 19, was shot in Nanterre by a neighbor very soon afterwards. The families of both Wahid and Abdenabi met with others and organized themselves around La Folle de Place Vendôme, the mothers of the Place de Vendôme, in reference to the mothers of La Madre de Plaza del Mayo, the mothers of the Plaza del Mayo in Argentina, a group of mothers who wanted to draw international attention to the fate of their missing children, student victims of the dictatorship. You can see a trajectory here between all these groups of families of community organizing against state racism, state fascism. Capturing and connecting this international legacy of resistance on film is part of Obstinate memory. It is a memory driven by the continuing demand for justice by families and communities who have suffered at the hands of the state, a suffering which takes the form of murder, torture, disappearances, and racialized policing. Migrant media employs third cinema techniques in production, screenings, and Q&A sessions with participants. Third cinema was a film movement that grew out of liberation theology and adopted film as a political practice made in conjunction with the people to reflect their lived reality and their political critiques. With incendiary rhetoric, documentary in particular offered a form that could be the basis of revolutionary filmmaking. Every image that documents bears witness to, refutes, or deepens the truth of a situation, something more than a film image or purely artistic fact. It has become something which the system finds indigestible. Testimony about a national reality is also an inestimable means of dialogue and knowledge on the world plane. The insistence of remembering and engaging in third cinema practice is part of Obstinate memory. It is the need to confront the domination of mainstream first cinema, especially in a world where global media power is fluid. To be effective, editorial decision-making in a documentary force is political and emotionally confrontational in nature. Developing long-term relationships with participants is essential to the filmmaking approach. These also relate to an aesthetic of resistance, which in relation to migrant media's work is described by Daniels as constructed through hybrid filmic strategies of critical realism and the poetic, and describes the film as having the sensation of spectorial destination that evokes emotion and reflection. Reflection and remembrance are part of the testimonial power of filmmaking, but the filters involved in the creative processes are also political. It is important to outline the foundational origins of the Bradford 12. Political activists Tariq Mahmoud and Tolochan Gata had been founding members of the Asian Youth Movement and leading members of the United Black Youth League. It was they who called for an organized defense of the community when the threat of a fascist attack emerged in July 1981. After the making of petrol bombs, Tariq and Tolochan were arrested along with 10 others. The charges of conspiracy and terrorism could lead to life imprisonment if convicted. The police said they were terrorists. The community rebutted, "They are our sons." The trial took place in Lee's Crown Court in 1982. These were political charges. The state prosecution maintained the 12 were terrorists. They rebutted they were the victims of terror and not terrorists. Thousands of people from Bradford, across the country, and internationally supported them. The jury believed them. Their acquittal established the right of organized and, if necessary, armed community self-defense. This was a historic victory, one that must be written by the victors. Patricio Guzman exemplifies a cinematic commitment to a cause over a lengthy period. He's from the Battle of Chile in 1975 to Nostalgia for the Light in 2010, displays an archive of a political struggle for the liberation of a country from dictatorship, in this case Chile. Guzman regards documentary as a great archive of humanity. Of course, this archive can be interpreted and misinterpreted when histories are mediated through the monoform. Asian youth were anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist. They had identified with their brothers and sisters in South Africa fighting apartheid, as well as the struggle of Palestinians against genocidal violence and settler colonialism. This international solidarity was why they called themselves Black, shouting the slogan, "Black people must unite, here to stay, here to fight." They wanted to build solidarity between all those fighting racism and the oppression of the British states. The youth recognized Ireland as the Britain's oldest colony. They supported the campaign for the Irish Republican hunger strikers. This militancy is what is ignored by mainstream media, and it is this very militancy that is needed today to confront growing national fascisms and the continuing slaughter of the peoples of the global South. Obstinate memory continues even when the mainstream television cameras and journalists disappears. It continues when the liberal NGOs move to the next case. It continues after the fake reviews carried out as appeasement by the government who employ their elites to create the illusion of concern. They are all no more than distraction techniques to give the impression of progress and are used to entice collaboration in a system, one that cannot be reformed, but instead must be overthrown. Today, the liberal has become a key barrier against liberation. Filmmakers should reject the soft history approach of mainstream media, which is no more than an attempt at the containment of struggles. They do not celebrate militancy, they minimize it. Films made politically, with the people, for the people, must give voice to these silenced radical histories.